Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for coming. I'm sorry, there's some slight technical difficulties about the slow movement of electrons today. Delayed the start of this, but my apologies, and thank you for all of you who have taken your time to discuss this really important topic. I'd like to welcome you to the Blue Economy CRC's webinar. I'm Professor Charles Sampford, Foundation Dean of Law and Director of the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law in Griffith. Before we move, I naturally want to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and on the waters about which we'll be discussing today. I want to pay my respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I want to especially pay respect to the Turrbal and Jagera people who lived in what they called Meanjin and which we have very recently come to call Brisbane. I also want to acknowledge on behalf of all the unwelcome boat people who came from Europe from after 1788 and acknowledge that the traditional custodians took a much more direct route from Africa to Australia than we did. When our forebears came out of Africa, they veered left around what's now Damascus, whereas the indigenous ancestors made a much better move, turned right and got here at least 60,000 years before our forebears were even aware of this place. After wasting all those years in the damper marches of the European peninsula, our forebears turned up before the custodians were able to implement a boat turn-back policy or, more relevantly, organise a referendum to say no to our voice. For all this, we must make amends in our work as citizens, as researchers, and of course as concerned and committed Blue Economy participants. And the Blue Economy, I want to acknowledge and thank you very much for their tremendous support and their serious way in which they've gone about the ethical issues involved. The Blue Economy CRC was established with a 10-year life under the Australian Government's CRC program in July 2019. With now 44 participants from Australia and around the globe, the purpose of the Blue Economy is to perform world-class collaborative, industry-focused research and training that underpins the growth of the Blue Economy through increased offshore and sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy production. I must say that from the very beginning, the CRC, even before it won its grants from the federal government, was always looking at ethics and social licence. When the discussions were being held about the shape and form of the Blue Economy CRC, I didn't have to mention social licence. It was some of the industry partners who expressed that, and I think that this is a good start on what's, I think, a long journey. Today's webinar is about ethics and social licence in the Blue Economy. This webinar will discuss ethics, integrity and social acceptance in the Blue Economy, delving into the nature of integrity systems and their importance along with exploring the social licence to operate. Social licence to operate in itself can have different meanings for different people and can be used in ways that are ethically constructive or ethically problematic. We've got two speakers today, myself and the Deputy Director of the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law, Dr. Hugh Breakey, who is a Senior Research Fellow and a noted philosopher. We'll each do a 25-minute presentation followed by questions and answers at the end. Please address your questions in the Q&A box on the screens. There is an upvote option too, so that all the popular questions will get moved to the top of the list to assist during Q&A time. The first presentation will be by myself on ethics, integrity in the Blue Economy, and Dr. Hugh Breakey will be talking about social licence in the Blue Economy. If you move next slide, please. Back in 2020, we started this project as part of the Sustainable Offshore Developments Program, reminding ourselves that sustainability is more than just a matter of more than a physical matter. It's also an ethical matter in order to keep the affected populations on side and contributing to the development of the program. The project team is listed here: myself, Hugh, Dr. Graham Wood from Tasmania, our research fellow Katja Cooper and research assistant Rebecca Marshall-Say and Shay O'Hara-Smith. The project participants and steering group members are listed there: BMT Carnegie, Tasmanian Department of Dipitwi, as we call it, Tassal, and New Zealand King Island Salmon. Next slide, please. What I'll be talking about, giving introduction and its conceptual foundations to individual and institutional ethics and values, the variety of values that might be considered, and Hugh will be discussing social license. Thank you. There are lots of ways of starting an ethical dialogue. One of my favoured ones is Peter Singer's basic ethical question is, for him, it is, how should I live my life? It's a positive question about how you actually live. Next slide. For me, ethics involves, in order to understand how we should live, ethics involves asking hard questions about our values, giving honest and public answers, and trying to live by those answers. If we do, we have integrity, we are true to our values, we are true to ourselves, and we are the person that we claim to ourselves and to others that we are. Next slide. However, as it is for individuals, so it is for institutions, organisations, and industries. There's a parallel question to Singer's question. If Singer is asked, how do I live my life? It's an individual question. But we are human beings who gather in groups of all kinds. And so the ethical question is often, how do we live our lives together? And there are parallel set of questions which match very much the questions that an individual faces. An institution must ask hard questions of the value of the institution. What's it for? Why do we have it? Why is the community better off it because it exists? And what justifies the institution, and what values does it further? So firstly, just like an individual, an institution needs to ask hard questions about its values, it give honest and public answers, and live by them. Now, of course, the thing is that it's much easier, in theory at least, to ask questions of yourself and give answers of yourself, of what your values are and how you live up to them. Obviously, it's more complicated when it comes to an institution, an organisation, and an industry. Obviously, you have to pose the questions, generate answers, debate, discuss, and finally settle on a set of values for an institution. And the process by which you live by your values is obviously more complex, that you have to look at a variety of legal institutional means to make it clear what the right action is, make it easy to do the right thing, make wrong actions hard to do and easy to detect, what we actually call an integrity system. As I say, the second and the third questions are much more complex than they are for an individual, but they're every bit as necessary. Next slide, please. Oh yes, the thing is that what we need to do is to justify the institution, the community. What tends to happen, what we need to do is that if you decide to join an organisation, to take part in an industry, in that case, there's a constant process in which the members of an organisation justify that organisation to the community. Next slide. And why is justification important? Why should we justify ourselves to our colleagues, to our fellow citizens, to fellow inhabitants on this planet? That's because, first of all, every community gives the organisations within its territory powers and privilege. And the reason why we do create organisations is that we generally believe that more can be done collectively than individually. This applies very much to organisations. For instance, the legislatures in Australia generally have the power to legislate for the peace, order, and good government of the jurisdiction where they operate, or the right to practice a profession. There's a justification for the professional, for limiting professionals to those who've been trained, because of you can have a greater benefit to the community by actually acknowledging training and profession. And of course, limited liability joint stock corporations. There are many benefits that our standard form corporations actually have. The form of easily created limited liability joint stock corporations started in the mid-19th century in the United Kingdom. Now, they didn't do it just because it was good for the corporation, and you don't have a profession just because it's good for professions, and certainly you don't give the legislature powers to legislate anything they want unless it's on the understanding that they're doing it for the benefit of the community as a whole. And this is the reason the powers and privileges that any organisation has are the reasons why it's important to justify them and make sure that they give good reasons for their activities. Next slide, please. So for every government industry organisation, we need to ask two essential questions. What are the values that justify its creation? And what combination of ethical standard setting, legal regulation, incentives, and economic incentives and institutional design will deliver those values? And it's more likely to realise those values with a combination of mutually supportive elements than by one means alone. There are common mistakes in trying to ensure that organisations and industries live up to the values they claim. Sometimes some people just rely on only one means. You'll sometimes see that lawyers or economists think that all you need is, for lawyers, new laws, for economists, get your incentive rights. And some will rely on one institution, a single department, a single watchdog, a single industry or industry and watchdog. I think our human history and certainly our research indicates that it's much, much better to have a range of measures: ethical standard setting, legal regulation, institutional design, economic incentives, in order to ensure that institutions and industries live up to the values that they claim. Next slide. We tend to say, by the way, the thing is, is my image providing is blocking out some of the text here, or can you see it, Leslie?
No, I can only see text.
You can see the text. Good, that's fine. An integrity system we talk about, if you're going to sort of ensure that an organisation, institution has integrity, think in terms of having an integrity system that's the sum total of ethical standards, legal regulation, economic incentives, and institutional arrangements that promote integrity and further the values our institutions claim to stand for. These institutions, their relations and interactions shape behaviour and hopefully deliver a system that has that delivers on its promise, one that furthers its values. We call this values-based governance. Next slide. Next slide, Leslie. So what are those values? And obviously this is a process for each institution to go through. It's for us as researchers, it's for the industry, blue economy industries and so forth. What are the values? There are some, like Milton Friedman, who think that the only values are to obey the law, but provided you obey the law, maximize shareholder values, maximize profits. In fact, he described it as the ethical duty was to maximize profits. There are other sets of values. And there are many ways of trying to attend to ethical concerns and the ethical effects on others. There are a series of international business principles. United Nations Global Compact, United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, the Equator Principles, the Co-Roundtable, Green Cross, Earth Charter, Corporate Social Responsibility, Triple Bottom Line, ISO 14000 and Human Security. There are many, as I say, many attempts internationally to recognise that industries have responsibilities beyond merely making profits. Their role in making profits is, of course, one of the justifications for having them, but also the thing is that there are other things they need to do. The trouble with some of these very general principles is they tend to be so general as they provide a very limited guide. Some other sets of principles probably provide more guidance. We're most familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. especially number 2, no hunger, number 7, clean energy, number 9, industry, innovation, infrastructure, 12, responsible consumption, 13, climate action, and 14, life below water. So in fact, the thing is, we have a very large number of this UN Sustainable Development Goals which are relevant to the blue economy. Some others look at it differently and see that that the ethics of an organisation involves looking at the practical consequences of doing the wrong thing. That if you mistreat your employees, your supply chain operators, your communities, then this is ultimately inimical to long-term profitability, which I think is true. But in fact, no one can actually prove that acting dishonestly in one particular situation is not going to be profitable in the long term. And so that's why most of us sort of prefer ethics more than just a matter of the consequential consideration of what will happen if you do the wrong thing, but reasons why you should do the right thing in the first place. Other sources of values are stakeholder theory, which really looks at the various those who are impacted by change should be consulted and in a formal way. And so that this is stakeholder theory, which is popular in a number of areas. And finally, a social license to operate, which Hugh is going to talk about. But before we pass on to Hugh, just like to discuss some of our own research. We've discussed the next slide, please. We have attempted not only just to look at the structure of how organisations need to justify themselves to the community of which they're a part, but we've also done a thorough investigation through the blue economy literature to look at some of the values that those in the literature argue should should be chosen by the blue economy. And as you see, the thing is that there's and these are probably not particularly surprising. Sustainability is put very high, equity and distributive justice, stakeholder participation. When it says rights and harms, that's respecting rights and avoiding harms. Stakeholder analysis, we just talk about. Public perception, which is related to some sense is one part of social license to operate. Ecological ethics and food security, which actually is one of the strong arguments that have been used for the blue economy CRC here, but are not quite so broadly supported in the literature. Animal welfare rights, consumer preference, food safety, social license to operate has a, as you can see, is not quite so common within the blue economy literature. Corporate social responsibility, which we've just been discussing, and the utilitarianism and deontological ethics are basically just two different ways of arguing for ethics. So all the other ones are substantive, and the last two could be seen as procedural. We'll miss the next slide and then go on to the other one, the last slide, this one. In the literature also, we look to see what the practical outcomes should be. And there are many arguments the literature has the different forms of change we should look at. And some of these, by the way, of course, are overlapping. Regulation reform and law and policy reform are obviously closely related, just different ways of expressing it. And so the this is derived from a very intensive study led by Dr. Cooper, in which Dr. Brakey and I and two others took part. So I'll leave my presentation there. Thank you very much for listening, and I now will hand over to Hugh Brakey. Hugh.
Wonderful, thank you, Charles. Let me just start up my screen and share. Lovely. All right, welcome along, everybody, and thank you for that, Charles. That sets the scene for a number of the things I'll be talking about with respect to ethics and integrity and integrity systems, which I'll be touching on a little bit as we go. But the main thing I want to focus on here is to talk us through the notion of the social license to operate and how it plays out in the blue economy, and why we find it rearing its head in blue economy industries, where it's not the case that the social license to operate is a major player in industries around the world, or even in industries in Australia. But social license as a concept, as a term, is something that we're seeing for several years now, increasingly in the blue economy space in Australia and to some extent around the world. So I want to talk a little bit about the social license to operate in the sense of trying to clear up some of the ambiguities. It's a complex term. It does mean different things to different people, and that means that people can have very different views on it. It's quite possible to find people who are really enthusiastic about the social license to operate, and I think it's been a really good thing, and it's wonderful that we're using it now in the context of industries like blue economy industries. And there are others who think that it has been an unmitigated disaster and that it's incredibly problematic and misleading term. And so hopefully by the end of this presentation, it'll be a little bit clearer why we have those different meanings that we ascribe to the social license, and why they can lead to people having very different views on whether or not it's a good thing for us that we have the social license to operate as being part of our ethical discussion and discourse in this space. So here's what it'll look like in our presentation today. I'll begin and kick things off with a little bit of the history of social license to operate. It's only a new term in its current instantiation. I'll talk a little bit about why the social license to operate falls on a continuum. It's not a yes or no question that you have it or you don't, in the same way that, for example, a legal license is. I'll discuss some of the different definitions that are out there of the social license, and hopefully that will clue us in as to why people can have some different views on whether or not it's a good thing. I'll analogize from legal license, which is something we're probably all pretty clear about, to social license, and why there are differences there, and why in some cases those differences can be a worrying thing, and in some cases they can look like a really positive thing. I'll talk about different social license sort of strategies and approaches that we've seen in our research. And I'll talk about the way social license can appear to some as an empty buzzword, as a meaningless phrase that can be tacked on to just about anything because it has no substance, but can be seen equally as being an activist weapon to which they can use to berate industry and beat government, or contrary-wise, as an industry shield that they can use to deflect attention and critique that they don't want to confront, or whether, in the best of all worlds, it can be used as an ethical tool for us actually to move closer to the ethical standards that Charles was talking about. And so I'll close with working with the social license to operate when it's capable of being all these different things in different cases. So one of the odd things about social license to operate is that, in a sense, it was discovered by its absence. We realized that there was such a thing as a social license to operate only when it turned out that people had lost it, or corporations had lost it. Most of the time we had it and we never even noticed we had it because we hadn't really worked out what it would look like to lose it. So this is how it played out. In the late 1990s, we had lots of extractive industries, often multinational corporations, often working in developing countries that had secured a legal license for their mining activities. But in getting that legal license, often a number of those countries were pretty corrupt. And so the central government didn't necessarily have the interests of all at heart, and potentially definitely not the interests of, say, particular ethnic, perhaps indigenous communities in regions where the mining was going to take place. So the local community could be severely affected by these, affected in massive ways, to the point where communities might have to leave their homelands, to the point where there were literal physical and life risks to them, and also just the other types of risks that these things can create, impacts on infrastructure, impacts on roads, environmental problems, and so on. And so the local community could push back against these, and they could be up in arms. And in these original cases, they could be literally up in arms. So there was physical violence as communities tried to protect their existence and their well-being against what they perceived as being this sort of external and illegitimate activity that was happening. And so in the face of this, industry recognised that the local communities, sometimes when they're put in touch with international groups, could impose huge costs on the mining operations. So initially, social license to operate risks were operational risks. That's the way they were understood. The term social license to operate was created in order to have a way of talking about the operational risk that comes not from your profit and loss statement, not from are you going to lose your legal license, but from have you got the appropriate level of buy-in or at least tolerance from the local community so that they will not disrupt your operations in a significant cost potentially to your bottom line. So initially it was created by industry as a term to understand operational risk. But over time, and pretty much everyone agrees now that that understanding of social license has shifted, although there's debate on exactly what it's shifted to. But it's now phrased as more of a type of moral requirement, this idea that companies should have a social license to operate, which is different from the view that it would be wise, it would be prudential for a smart company to make sure it has a social license to operate. Now the idea is, well, even if it wouldn't be wise and prudential, you just should have one because it's the right thing to do. You should have managed to bring the community along with the operations that you're intending to roll out. So that's the history. So just a quick reminder that when we're talking about social license to operate, it's on a continuum because social license is in one way or another referring to community sentiment and whether or not the community is enthusiastic about what's happening or whether or not the community is very upset about what's happening. And so in that figure on the right, you can see a whole range of community sentiments, a continuum running all the way from the very, very top where you have identity and pride. So a local community can identify itself with a local corporation that they're proud that operates out of their town. They think it says something good about them, that they are part of this larger industrial activity. And then moving down a bit, you've got in relationships of trust and attitudes of respect and support. And then perhaps that bottom level, we might just have just a type of bare acceptance that it's okay for the operations to be doing what they're doing. And all of those are the type of positive community sentiments that will support the operations having a social license. And then we've got some middling ones. So we've got ambivalence in the sense that people might be thinking, well, I don't really have an opinion either way. There's good things, but there's also bad things. I'm on the fence about it. And of course, ignorance as well, where the community simply doesn't know much about the industry, doesn't know about what the industry operations are, what the effects of them are, and so simply has no position one way or the other on whether or not it should or shouldn't be happening. And then we get down to the pointy end where they have very different sentiments, where their sentiments are now negative sentiments, pushing back against the operations. And these would be at one level passive intolerance. So on this sentiment, we've got a community member or stakeholder who doesn't think the operation should be happening, would like to be resisting them, wants them to go away, but perhaps doesn't see any means by which they can affect that, by which they can contribute to the institutions being stopped. And then at the final end there, we have active resistance, where that person has been provided with perhaps enough other like-minded people around them that now they are actually willing and able to resist the operations through the variety of mechanisms that they might have. So we've got this community sentiment continuum, and of course different groups, especially in pluralistic democracies like Australia, will be supportive or opposed to different degrees. And this is just true of almost every type of operation you can imagine. It just is possible to find different people who are for or against, and they often will vary pretty strongly across the poles of that sentiment spectrum I've got there. The social license to operate might only be really visible, as it was with those mining corporations, when it gets all the way down to active resistance. So that's the point at which everybody knows that you've lost social license to operate. But really, the problems may have been brewing for some time. It may have been the operations had been sitting in that ambivalence or ignorance category, or even that they've been being passively not tolerated for a long time until finally a lightning rod or a flashpoint allowed people to come together and actively move against the operations. So one takeaway there is there's good reasons for aiming higher than acceptance. It's not really a good, viable long-term strategy to be just skating along at the very bottom of let's say, the acceptance category, because when things go wrong, you'll need a bank of goodwill, and you'll need trust if problems arise, so that people can trust that you're going to be able to fix those problems, you're going to respond to what's happening. And of course, the greater enthusiasm of some members of the population, the community, the stakeholders, may in some ways compensate for the lesser enthusiasm of others. So let's now look to defining the social license to operate. So it can be defined in a lot of different ways, and in the literature and sometimes just in popular discussion, social license to operate will be linked with legitimacy, which is great, but legitimacy itself is a pretty ambiguous term. So I'm going to simplify what is a pretty enormous literature and quite complex discussion, and just talk about two types of legitimacy: subjective legitimacy and normative legitimacy. So subjective legitimacy asks the question, are the operations accepted? If we go out to the community, if we go out and poll stakeholders and ask their opinions, what do they think? What is their sentiment telling us? Where are they on that continuum? And how many of them are for or against? How many are very opposed? How many are very enthusiastic? So subjective legitimacy is the question, does the community itself accept the operations that are happening in its locale? And it's a question that could be solved by sociologists or ethnographers. It's a question you could poll people and you could find out the answer to this question. And often when people are talking about social license, this is what they're talking about. Their social licenses can often be simply a way of talking about social acceptance. Do people accept what's going on? But there's another meaning that we can give to social license to operate, and another meaning we can give to the term legitimacy. And this is normative legitimacy. And this doesn't ask if the operations are accepted. It asks if the operations are acceptable. So this isn't a sociological question about what people actually think. This is a moral question about the types of objective standards that we would expect operations to be living up to. So that means it's quite possible for an operation to have subjective legitimacy, but not normative legitimacy. The operation might be doing terrible things, but the community doesn't know about it. So they have subjective legitimacy, but they don't have normative legitimacy. And equally, the other way around is possible as well. It's possible to have lost subjective legitimacy because the community made perhaps a mistaken, misinformed decision about whether or not the operations were okay, but at the same time, the operations are themselves acceptable. So they're different concepts, but they often will run together, and that's why social license to operate can sometimes refer to both of them, and it's why the word legitimacy itself can sometimes refer to both of them. The complexity arises because of this third point I've got here. Social license to operate can also be invoked as a way of asserting that the one depends on the other. That is, that normative legitimacy depends on subjective legitimacy, which might in plain terms be put along these lines. You no longer have the moral right to be doing these operations because you've lost the community's acceptance of what you are doing. So this is saying that from the subjective legitimacy, from the actual fact of the matter about what people think, we should be able to conclude that actually the operations should or should not be happening. Now, that may be an intuitive thing to say, and there's probably a bunch of cases where we do want to make that inference. We do want to say, well, if you no longer have the community on board with what you're doing, then you just shouldn't be doing it. It might be a valid inference. Equally well, it just might not be a valid inference. After all, and it's worth keeping this in mind, we don't normally rely on current community sentiment to decide that operations are legitimate. Rather, we tend to rely on democratic institutions to pass legal rules that are impartially enforced. And there's good reasons for that. There's good reasons why we opt for democratic institutions, legal rules, and we hope to have impartial enforcement of it. because communities can get things wrong, of course, and there's a bunch of other reasons as well we can speak to a bit in the Q&A if you want. So there's good reasons for us relying normally on law and democratic legislation to say, well, I guess if you're obeying the law of the land, you're not violating all of the things that we've laid down, it's okay for you to continue doing what you're doing. We may not like it, but we're going to accept it. Social license to operate is gesturing towards a time we might not want to say that. We might want to say that even though you're respecting the law as it stands, we're still worried about what's going on, and we still think that if you lose the community's voice on this, then you're morally in trouble. So it's worth thinking about that sort of implicit idea that we have that social license says we should easily move from what the community thinks to what actually should be the case morally. Sometimes that will be absolutely a valid thing for us to do, and sometimes it'll be really problematic, and it's worth being aware that this inference is often getting made when people are invoking the social license to operate. Okay, so it might be helpful to analogize to legal license, which is something that we're all familiar with. Obviously, we can have legal licenses for corporations to do various types of operations, for the government, for that matter, to do various types of operations. But we also have, many of us have legal licenses like a driver's license, which will be helpful here to keep in mind when we're comparing with the social license to operate. So what are the questions we can ask about a legal license? Well, we can ask, from whom is the license coming? Who issues the license? Now, in the case of the legal license, it's pretty clear there's a single clear authority who has the legitimate authority to exercise and issue that license. In social license to operate, it is murkier. It's the community and major stakeholders who have that power. To whom? Who holds the license? Again, with legal licenses, this is pretty clear. It's the entity who applied for the license and was granted the license and is doing the operations. For social license to operate, it might not be quite as clear, because what can happen with social license is it's going to cover the operators, the actors themselves who are doing stuff, but it might also cover all other operators who are doing a similar type of thing. It might even cover all other and future operators who may be doing the same thing. So, for example, if one industry operator is behaving pretty poorly and the social license to that operator is removed, that may also suffice to rule out future operators. It may mean that the entire industry is no longer tolerated by the community. So for what activity, legal license is going to be pretty specific. Social license, the activity can be more general, shifting over time and not as precisely articulated. For how long? Well, legal license is often very clear when it's going to finish. Social license, well, it depends. How long you're going to hold the social license for depends on perceptions of your conduct and of the outcomes of what you were doing. It may be withdrawn without notice, which would be a rare thing, an exceptional thing in the legal case, but certainly could happen in the social license case. And this is one thing that underlines why industry would do well to think that they need a strong SLO, because it's the thing that can give them a sense that the continued operations into the future that they're going to need to rely on if they're going to make investments, if they're going to employ people and so forth. That's what's going to be required, not just a marginal social license that will just get you over the line for the time being. So on what conditions? For a legal license, the conditions are going to be very clear and they're going to be spelled out at the very beginning. Social license is going to be more flexible about those conditions. And probably the key issue here is that communities can expect emerging problems to be fixed. If I go off and get a license, a legal license for something, and it turns out that there are problems with what I'm doing with respect to the activities that have been licensed, that doesn't necessarily mean I need to be in trouble for those activities or that I need to stop performing those activities because I'm obeying all of the license conditions that I started with. That's not so with social license. If something pops up that nobody anticipated and we're looking at social license, it absolutely can be the community expectation that those emerging problems that were not anticipated early on now need to be fixed if the social license is to be secured. And finally, what are the consequences for breach? In law, it will usually be very clear. in social license, it will be often more flexible. There's a variety of types of pushback that can occur, various types of activism, of course, boycotts and so forth, and a not uncommon aim of community members when the social license has collapsed is for there to be a revocation or an impact on some form of the legal licenses that are in play. So we move, in this case, from the sociological fact, as it were, of the failure of social license to the actual tangible legal consequence of a change in legal status, or perhaps to an enlivening of the stance of the regulator, for example, to be much more aggressive with what's going on. And we've seen these consequences from social license across the world in a number of cases. So 4 operational approaches to social license. So the first one we call strategic social license. And this is where the social license rhetoric is simply used and eagerly used to just hide or skate over wrongdoing and into what's called ethics washing. There probably is no term, no ethical term there's ever been invented or ever will be invented that a nefarious actor will not employ in order to try and cover up what they're doing. And that, as it can happen to sustainability, as it can happen to good governance, integrity itself is one of the most commonly invoked corporate values. Social license to operate rhetoric can also be used in order to try and cover up wrongdoing or distract away from investigations of wrongdoing. The next one's a bit more subtle. This we're calling tick box social license to operate. And this one arises from what's often a quite understandable desire of industry to have clear requirements on what they need to actually do. And so what can happen here, for example, is the role of certification becomes primary, and the industry goes, well, so long as I've got that certification done, I know I'm safe because they are the ones that are giving me the social license. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. It absolutely is true that certification will be one of the things that most communities will take on board and will bear in mind when they're working out, well, should we accept this organization? It's got a, let's say, sustainability certification, so that's a positive in favor of it. But it's also true that the community might decide that that certification is not broad enough, for example, to cover all the things they care about, or in fact, the certifier themselves can have a collapse in legitimacy, no longer be trusted, and the certification suddenly becomes just a piece of worthless paper. So the tick box SLO is understandable because industry can be frustrated in knowing exactly what they need to do to live up to their social license requirements. But ultimately, it's a pretty narrow and can be risky way of interpreting social license. There's default social license, which is the idea is just keep your head down and avoid notice, which you occasionally see in some operations and some industries. Can be risky, has a higher risk profile, because if something goes wrong, that's the first thing everybody knows about what's happened about your corporation, your company, your operations. So it's a risky thing to do, but it is a strategy that's adopted at some points. And finally, there's authentic social license to operate. And here we're talking about the types of things that Charles was talking about earlier. You have genuine engagement with the community, the pursuit of institutional integrity, i.e. working out what your values are, publicly saying them and trying to deliver on them, and ethical practice. So authentic social license, as I just mentioned it, so it involves looking up to those ethical values, aligning with ethical values. At the end of the day, community acceptance concerns just aren't surprising. They really do closely track ethical expectations. If you look at the type of things that ethics literature is going to be saying, it would be a good idea if you were doing these, they're pretty close to the types of things that communities respond to. So what I've just got here in the table there is I've got a CSIRO 2017 study. This wasn't blue economy, this was mining, but I like this particular study because they really did the quant work here to work out how much impact all of these different factors were having on ultimately community acceptance. And so they came up with these qualities that I've put there under impacts environmental, impacts social and other, benefits, procedural fairness, which is voice, distributional fairness, who's getting what, are people who are being impacted by costs getting recompensed, etc., and governance issues. And those factors that they're putting forward in terms of these are the type of things that make communities favour or disfavour accepting industrial operations are almost identical to the types of things you find and the types of things we in fact did find when we went and looked. Charles briefly adverted to the work we'd done both in the literature and independent ethical analysis, where we came up with those 6 blue economy ethical values, which are in a practitioner summary, which is available if anyone wants it. So it's almost a one-for-one. There's an enormous amount of overlap. So it's for most of the time, it's not strange what communities are interested in and what communities want from corporations if they're going to accept the operations that they're doing. What they want is the type of ethical values that are pretty straightforwardly, visible in the literature. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that for some, social license will be a vital lever for ethical action. And that's because the authentic social license to operate is possible. It actually does happen. Sometimes it can be a really good prompt for industry to work out what their values are and pursue them authentically and be accountable to what they're doing. And in those cases, it's a really good thing. It's also true that social license to operate can be invoked as a shield for industry. They may say, look, we've got environmental sustainability certifications, so we have social license. And they might try and use that to sort of block criticism or block interrogation of the ethics of what they're doing. Ambiguity works both ways. It can also be used as an activist weapon. It can be something that is picked up and used to bludgeon operations in a way that actually just doesn't align with, say, for example, what the best environmental science is happening. So the ambiguity can become a shield for industry or a weapon for activists, or it can be used by either as a way of prompting ethical action. And finally, it can become an empty buzzword in different contexts. The different users of social license can be any of these. Okay, this is my final substantive slide. I won't go into too much detail because I do want to get to questions pretty soon. But hopefully what I've said has made us realize, well, yeah, the social license to operate as a concept, as an idea, as a phenomenon that is in our ethical discourse now and in what is happening in the world around us, it does have some ethical values, some promise. It can prompt critical discussion of industry values and ethics. It encourages engagement with local communities and stakeholders. And it can alert industry to ethical risks, where NGOs can function almost as the canary in the coal mine, letting you know ahead of time the problem areas that you should be attending to. But at the same time, social license does have its own ethical risks, reasons why we might be a little worried about it. It might be, if social license is the only reason an industry is interested in doing the good thing, then that can be problematic because you can just ignore the intrinsic reasons for doing what's right and can ignore the fact that almost, most people that work for industries, as most human beings do, have values that you can appeal to. And a lot of those values are going to be pretty standard, common sense ethical values, exactly the same types of things as I had up on the slide just a moment ago. There's a risk with social license if we try and narrow it to just a box ticking exercise in terms of certification or seeing it as a credential. And equally, there's also a risk we can put too much in the hands of fickle community opinion rather than stable law. So the right answer here is going to be a way of looking at how social license and law and regulation can all work together to get good results here. And attending to the social license to operate, and this may be something we can pick up on the Q&A perhaps, but it's important to acknowledge that industries don't just get social license from what they do themselves. They also get social license from the system that surrounds them, from the fact that there are scientists that work in universities that do environmental and ecological research, that there are certifiers, that there is a government and the government has a regulatory agency that is effective and impartial. All of those types of things can encourage people's belief in the legitimacy of what's going on. But it does create a bit of a trap. On the one hand, industry can be too oppositional, too removed from all of those important institutions. But there's also a flip side where the industry can be too close to all of those institutions and it is seen as there's too much overlap between the science and the certifiers and the industry, then that can undermine the industry's capability to create social license, because it undermines the independence, the objectivity of their institutions and their role in the integrity system. So there's a few takeaways there that I want to draw attention to. Let me sum up. So blue economy industries are what? They're dynamic, innovative, they're changing. They offer great promise of benefits, healthy food, renewable energy, and more. They're operating in a still emerging, but I would say currently challenged regulatory and governance environment, just because anything you're doing on the water is just hard to govern. That's just the reality of where we live. You're operating on public resources most of the time, and you're impacting on important ecosystems. So that just looks like a recipe. Those 5 factors are just going to create a situation where there are ongoing ethical risks and when social concerns are inevitable. At the same time, because of all those 5 factors, it's also a space that can be sensibly navigated with forethought, with goodwill, and with openness. All right, I might finish up there, and we might turn it over to questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you very much, Hugh. That was tremendous, and I think we all appreciate it. And we've already got some questions coming here. I'll read out the questions and either have a go at myself, pass it to you, or we'll both respond. The first one: so social license is just a rebranding of, quote, corporate social responsibility. What's new about this? In the same way that it's been done before, how is that not a very basic buzzwordy lip service to pretend that companies and researchers are actually caring about what people want? I think that it's not just a rebranding of corporate social responsibility. I think that the point I made in one of those slides is that there are different ways of trying to give general guidance and advice and values. But the thing is that corporate social responsibility is like many others, the co-principles and the UNGC and the UNPRI. These are different ways of trying to express something similar. So in a sense, it is something that it refers to something that's been similar before, but each of those things, the various general principles for business that have been put forward by the United Nations and private businesses and groups, most of them, I think, have been a genuine attempt to discuss what are the values that that industries should pursue, other than just profit. And I think the thing is that each of them has different origins, and social license does have a different origin. As Hugh said, the thing is, it emerged actually when people suddenly discovered that just having a legal license from the local colonel or dictator isn't sufficient to be able to run your business if in fact that you lose your social license. So I think that in many ways there are lots of similarities, and I think what we do in our work is to try to compare these various principles of corporate social responsibility, United Nations Global Compact, and so forth. So there is a lot of similarities, and it's important to work out the similarities. And there can be a lot of cynicism. I know we've gone talk about greenwashing going back 20 or 30 years. So yes, the thing is, looking at the different kinds of expressions of values that organisations and industry should have. In a sense, there's nothing new about this, but each of them does come from a different direction, and each of them can, in fact, be used cynically. I think Hugh made that point very strongly, that they can be used very cynically, but sometimes they can be genuine guidance. And of course, we want to structure social license to operate in such a way that those who are genuinely trying to benefit the communities can get recognition for it, and that those who aren't will be found out. Do you want to add anything, Hugh?
Yeah, no, you said it all pretty well. But it is worth highlighting the point made by the question the question asker, that there is a sense of buzzword. Really, every time something new comes out into this space, there can be a lot of sort of enthusiasm and excitement that this is that this is something new, and that so now finally, for example, corporations are getting it. And sometimes, in some cases, there will be something new, and it will be something that has a type of appeal or type of leverage that previous corporate social responsibility, for example, codes didn't have. But equally, there is that worry that sometimes something comes out and it is just a new word to say that really is going to ultimately, when we look back in 10 or 20 years, we're going to find it was just beset by the same reasons that, you know, corporate social responsibility has done some good in some places, but it's also been a word that turned out to be very easy to hide behind. And it wouldn't necessarily be a surprise if we found a bunch of instances where because it was the latest new fashionable word to use, it actually sort of provided a better ethics washing sort of appeal than just going back to the same old sort of corporate social responsibility. Oh yes, we take our ethical obligations seriously in that sense. So time will tell. But my feeling is, and as Charles said in his comment, look, sometimes it just is going to be used in those ethics washing senses, and sometimes it is going to be used in a general sense, in a genuine sense. And it will just come down to the particular context and who's using it and what particular motives and intentions they have and want to follow through on.
I think actually when Malcolm Turnbull described the banks as having lost their social license to operate a few years ago, that was quite a good use of the term, I thought. But nonetheless, we have different views. The next question is, if the license conditions aren't adequately addressing the concerns of the community who share the residential areas with industry, and democratic government set regulations also aren't addressing the issues adequately, there's no room for normative legitimacy, because when industry operations breach a moral code by respecting people's basic human rights to peace and sleep in their homes, no threshold of normative legitimacy can exist. In this circumstance, when government sides with industry against those residents when they express concerns, where are we left to go forward? Hugh.
Oh, yeah, good question. I mean, and worth remembering that social license did arise in cases where it absolutely was the case that the governments at the time probably had very limited legitimacy. You know, they just weren't good democracies in themselves. But at the same time, they also weren't responding to the local community concerns at all. And so the idea there is, well, one of the reasons why we have social license to operate, one of the reasons why this has popped up as a thing is because of a legitimacy failure, is because democracies aren't doing the stuff that they are meant to do. And, you know, obviously you've got some basic human rights there. If there's pretty basic stuff that a government has become out of touch with, then something like social license to operate is bound to arise, precisely because, I mean, Charles sort of mentioned briefly how all institutions are sort of forever, including governments, are forever needing to justify themselves and what they do to the people that make up and give license to and allow those institutions to be built and allow those institutions to operate. So once you have operations that are doing bad things that the democracy should be but isn't picking up on, it does create an invidious situation. It creates an invidious situation for everyone in a sense, because the only options then are to try and resist what's going on and to protest and so on, or to resist in more forthright ways. But at the same time, it doesn't wind up being a good place for industry to be in either, precisely because industry does prefer law, because law is predictable and law settles expectations. It allows people to invest. It allows people to get jobs and people to plan for their future. So there's lots of really good reasons why law is important and why it's much better if we can be resolving these things through democracy and through, therefore, the rule of law. But at the same time, that's precisely the failure that we get if we have democracies that aren't living up to sort of the minimal requirements that we might impose on them, because then the mechanism through which we would use the law to resolve the problem acknowledging that law and democracy are definitely the best ways of resolving these problems. But if that mechanism is being denied us, then yeah, it's a real problem. So that's why we have social license to operate in a way.
Leslie Cowdery from the BCRC wanted to respond to that. Is that still the case, Leslie?
No, Charles, I'm just marking them off as you answer them.
Okay. Oh, okay. That's fine. Jessica Coughlin, what is the blue economy stance on the Morgian Gate? Environmental sustainability has been destroyed in Macquarie Harbour by the deficit the ecosystem has been operating in since industry expansion in 2015, 2016, and now harm avoidance is not possible. Jessica says certifications in Macquarie Harbour default to the government regulations, and the regulations do not test for dissolved oxygen at deeper levels where the skate lives and breathes. They only test to 5 minutes. Shouldn't an impending extinction risk classify as a canary in the coal mine scenario? Hugh, the thing is that you like to grow canaries for coal mines.
Yeah, well, so short answer is yes. A canary in a coal mine is a warning that things are going wrong. And a canary in a coal mine doesn't mean that you have to immediately stop everything that you're doing and not do it. But boy, it does mean you need to do more testing, and it does mean you need to get this stuff right. And so the current way that the skate is being is being threatened really does look like this is precisely one of those. I mentioned when we were talking about social license how it should be responding to emerging issues, emerging problems that arise, and therefore it can be legitimate to say, well, hang on, things are happening that we didn't think was going to happen. But in this case, I don't even think that we're talking about an emergent issue, right? The sort of the worries in Macquarie Harbour and the amount of oxygenation that was going to go into the water, given a bunch of well-known geographical features, was something we knew at the outset. And so it really looked like something where you had to be really, really careful in doing the operations. And you had to be constantly testing in all of the ways that were going to be able to make you confident that this was going to live up to what was originally promised, what the values were when they were initially raised, and the decisions were made to put stuff in. And if the values that were being raised at that point aren't being abided by, and there aren't the systems in place that allow the community to know that those values are being abided by, then you've got a real problem. So is it a canary in a coal mine? It just is, yes.
It seems to be a good example of a social license to operate, just following the legal license doesn't protect you if something goes radically wrong. Richard Finlay Jones asks, sorry, that's just jumped. My apologies. That it just jumped up because of more. The offshore wind zones recently announced on the New South Wales and Victorian coastlines has polarised some coastal communities between pro-renewables and anti-wind sentiment. How do you see the outrage being reduced to allow projects to proceed effectively? There's probably going to be a lot of different answers to that. I would say, and I really want Hugh's view on this, that it's important to really talk about those values. Obviously, there's a clash of values. Be very clear about those values, and as I say, ask them honestly. And I think the thing is that you need to persuade. You need to understand the concerns, to put them in value terms, and then to have open discussion. And I think that's the first start. Sometimes, of course, things that there are irreconcilable differences, and it may be better to go somewhere else. Or if there are irreconcilable differences, sometimes the decision has to be made. But the politicians themselves will actually want, in setting laws and regulations, to try to satisfy the legitimate interests as well as the noisy interests. Hugh, any further?
Yeah, spot on. So this is a good question, and it is only going to become a more pertinent question for Australia in the coming years. There's lots of offshore wind zones that have been planned. It looks offshore wind on all the current ways of thinking about this just forms a really, really important part of Australia's renewable energy targets and where we're trying to get to. But at the same time, these things just do have significant impacts, significant ecological impacts, and often social infrastructure impacts. The wind itself, for example, might be offshore, but the transmission has to be to onshore places, and you need to have ports that are capable of handling these very, very large things. So, we're talking about a significant amount of industrialization of areas of the ocean that were hitherto pretty nature friendly, because of course that's often where we will build these things. There's this perpetual tension between, well, if you build them in really remote areas, then you're impacting on on ecologies that are sort of much more wild and potentially much more precious. But of course, you don't want to put them where everything else is happening, because then they actually impact on human beings. They create safety risks. They impact on fishermen and fisher people, etc. So it is absolutely a question that is only going to become more pertinent, and we're going to see it play out in what's termed green on green conflicts, where you have a green environmentally based reason for wanting to have the offshore wind there, because climate change is absolutely happening, and if Australia doesn't stop what it's doing right now, so the status quo in what we have in Australia just is not environmentally sustainable. So something has to give, something has to change. We have really strong environmental green reasons for wanting to move to renewable electricity. But at the same time, the turbines, and there are different types of turbines, of course, and different ones, floating versus ones that are into the ocean floor, all have different impacts. But they will all have different types of impacts on seabirds, on whales, on the way fishing and fishery stuff is happening in those local areas. So there will be impacts on the local ecologies. So that's where we get that green on green issue from. And as well, they will impact on local communities, perhaps because the lovely little place that people enjoy, because it's such a lovely windswept beach that's away from the rest of the world and allows people to go there and recharge themselves and get in touch with nature. Well, we're going to have to industrialize that area, and we're going to have to build a big port, because we're going to need to have these big turbines being built and shipped and moved from the mainland to these coastal areas. So it is a really complex area, and I think the ways forward will just be fraught, but at the same time, they're necessary things we need to do. They're just really good reasons why we need to see offshore wind happening, and there are really good reasons why coastal communities are making entirely legitimate and important arguments on the basis of their local concerns and on the basis of their concerns for local ecologies. And so it really just will be a real test of government, mainly government, to see how well they can negotiate this space and how well they can respect all of the genuine ethical values that are in play on both sides of this equation.
There's enough. Next question is, this is a very good question. Do you have examples of blue economy projects that have been successfully achieving not just social license, but also delivering meaningful social benefits to the communities in which they operate? And I think, by the way, we tend to see social license and meaningful social benefits as being not conflicting or contradictory, but actually the latter is an important part of the former. Now, I'm not sure, as far as the blue economy projects coming out of this CRC, this has only been going. This has been going for about the length of COVID, and so there's a lot of plans and structuring and trying to get an idea how to get it right with engineers, economists, and ethicists. I suppose I could say the 3 E's of social license, but I'm just going to ask you. Maybe there's something in the literature will answer those questions, because I think that probably the question is what to be CRC done, and probably Leslie or somebody's going to jump in and say, you've forgotten about such and such we've just been doing. But I think that there's probably also a broad question about those with social license to operate, either in Australia before the BCRC, and of course some of the things in other countries which have gone through much more massive both salmon fisheries. I remember being in a World Council of Churches colloquium on on carbon taxes and carbon trading, and there was a lot of talk back in 2000 about some of the terrible things that were happening with salmon farms off the coast of Chile. And of course, the thing is that there's in the North Sea, there are just sort of, it's amazing how many things they've got to try to do with the very, very small. The Netherlands north part of the North Sea is tiny, and they've got a whole lot of wind farms and so forth. So, and I don't want to pass judgment on those, although I would think that possibly you'd argue that a blue economy activity in Australia, which has got a lot of social license for a long time, is the oyster beds. Just sort of my first reaction is that, and somebody's probably going to come along and tell me you've completely forgotten about this particular disaster in this particular time and place, in which case I feel thoroughly connected. I think the thing is the BCRC is very conscious that there are a lot of things you have to get right, but there are possibilities if you do. And it's important to ask and ensure that the projects actually do meet those criteria. But I was wondering, Hugh, if there's anything from the BCRC or from offshore, international rather, experience that you could point to, that happy social license that we've been referred to.
Yeah, so the idea of the blue economy as a concept, so sometimes we can talk, we might think about it, okay, in association specifically with the blue economy CRC. The blue economy CRC, of course, got its name from the wider concept of the blue economy, which is roughly speaking the idea that we're engaging in an environmentally sustainable and socially respectable way with on water and in water industries. And so that would include, yeah, as Charles said, mussel fishing. It would, and then would include lots of operations that have been going on, in some cases sustainably, and in some cases not, for generations, in some cases for thousands of years. And so, yeah, and so, you know, it would include everything. It would include, for example, ecotourism activities that are happening on the water. So we're up here in Queensland. We have a lot of that going on in the Great Barrier Reef, and you know, one of the reasons that people could not want certain blue economy activities to happen is because they impinge on other blue economy activities, especially if you've got ecotourism ones and they've got proven sustainability, then they can be a really good reason for keeping the ecology safe and looking after it, because it's providing the sort of tourism effects. But yeah, there would just be a lot, because you know, because there's just lots and lots of ways in which communities have been engaging with their waters and coastal regions since the beginning of time, as a place of recreation and as a place of you know, cultural tradition, but also as a place where they can be fed and where they can grow things. So yeah, so there's just a lot going on in that space. The blue economy can encompass a lot, and so it's going to encompass a lot of very good things and very sustainable things that have been done for a long time, and it's also going to encompass a lot of things that where we've just seen, you know, fishery collapses, for example.
Next question. The salmon industry continues to heavily lobby both federal and state governments, exaggerating its economic benefits and denying specific scientific evidence. Salmon Tasmania's figures have been completely discredited by respected economist Dr. Graham Wells, as well as by the Australia Institute. The science is clear. As Eloise argues, in Macquarie Harbour, the primary cause of oxygen depletion is salmon farming, and this has been linked to the decline of the endangered Moidian skate. What is your role and that of the CRC in addressing this misleading behaviour? Eloise Carr, Director, Australia Institute, Tasmania. I mean, our role is not to be a fact checker for particular claims. That's not actually our role. We're particularly interested in our institute in issues of lying and misleading, disinformation. We tend to do it as general principle, asking questions. So for us, the approach is to ask what are the relevant values, are they being met? And if not, why not? And expect those who actually make statements to live up to them. I think that's something that I was emphasising, and Hugh and I write about a lot, is that it's very important to ask hard questions about your values, give honest and public answers, and living by them. And so we set up that agenda. It's the asking the questions and providing a framework in which one can ask oneself ethical questions and deliver ethical outcomes. Now the thing is that ethicists don't have a court of appeal that can say that somebody's acted unethically, and therefore the High Court of Ethics who can make a final finding on this. But I think that I think we often point out that it's very important that you're clear about your values and you live up to them, because if not, you lose your social license and get into an awful lot of trouble. And also, I think, as Hugh and I have pointed out, you'll often lose your legal license too, because although a legal license may be for a specific time and a specific purpose, there's normally a bit of discretion in it. And if you abuse your legal license, and social license, in that case, you may find that that the minister has a power to suspend it, and don't come back here asking again. So I'm not making a statement about the particular issues. There others would know the science much better. I think that the ethicists are about trying to provide a structure in which you can engage in ethical reasoning, and social license to operate is one way of expressing the necessity that you speak the truth to your communities. But Hugh, you might have something else to say.
Yeah, no, you've said it pretty well. Just to reiterate that, I guess one of the points on my last slide about integrity systems and the importance of making sure and making visible to the community where there's an appropriate gap between what industries are doing and what the scientific institutions are doing, what the certifiers are doing, what the government's doing. And the more that the community sees that those relationships look like they're becoming too tight, and in some ways, it can be tricky for a government, for example, here, because on the one hand, as the policy making side of government, they might be feeling like they want to spruik the importance of this policy that they're putting forward that is going to create economic development, let's say through salmon aquaculture. But at the same time, they're also the police here. They are the regulators. They are the people that are meant to be assertively looking after and checking that everything that's going through is what was expected to be going through, and they're doing their job in that respect well. And that can be a tricky thing for governments to get right, because on the one hand, they're sort of wanting to publicly push something forward as being a great thing. And on the other hand, if things go wrong, well, it's the government and the regulators' responsibility to be able to push back on that and to be able to raise it with the community and let the community know what's going on. And I think one of the things that has happened in Tasmania with salmon aquaculture is that those relationships really did, as multiple ABC Four Corners shows have said, that those relationships really did become very tangled. And when you have a situation like that, then as Eloise said, then the science becomes up for grabs, and people are left saying, okay, well, the government is saying one thing about the science, the industry is saying the same thing about the science, and yet we have these other respected scientists who are saying a different thing. And so that's one reason why it's really important to get those integrity organisations around the corporations and around the industries and around the companies, around the operators, to get them to have that appropriate space and distance so that the community can have trust in what's going on.
Next question, a very good one again. How can a global social license and societal need for development, for instance, renewable and wind energy developments, be balanced with local social license conditions, e.g. opposition to any blue economy development? Now, to some extent, the thing is that human beings will have different values, and of course, you're referring to the fact that there's the responsibility as a global citizen and the desire to have a comfortable life as a local citizen may actually clash. I think that this is sort of, to some extent, the human condition, But I think the thing is that it's helpful if you could identify the various values involved, is something that the ethicists would do. And then the thing is that some of our policy people are quite good at coming up with win-win situations, or sort of win a bit, lose a bit. And also the thing is that the general principle is that if there's some big change which is a benefit to all, then in theory you should be able to compensate those who less well off. Now that's a very broad statement, and it won't apply in every situation. But I think the answer is be careful about, identify your values and help people as local citizens collect to their global citizenship. And it's a mixture of ethicists helping think through the values, and good policy people who actually manage to get at least a moderately win-win, and so that those who are suffering a bit don't suffer much, and they recognise that this is part of a greater good from which they benefit globally. Anything else? We might start moving through some of these a bit more quickly, which case your spectrum of community sentiments association is helpful, but at what point can or should anyone, e.g. industry, claim social licence, especially if we're unable to measure the subjective or normative legitimacy? Is this the downfall that it is claimed? I'm unaware of anyone saying you don't have SLO. Well, I think that, of course, the question is it's not just a matter for those who have SLO to claim SLO. They've got to earn it. And I think that's something we've put, I don't think it's in any of the slides, but something we've emphasised, that doesn't just happen. You can't just go along to a government you can't and get a social license in the way that you can your driver's license or your license to build a wind farm. So I think the answer really is that it's up to the people around to give the social license. And if you go around saying I've got a social license, you've got to be a bit careful, because if you don't have good evidence for that, people will think that you're a bit dishonest. Do you want to add something, Hugh?
Yeah, so I mean, there just are. I mean, NGOs nowadays, it just will be one of the things that they say when they decide they have got the community at large on their side. They will say you have lost your social license to operate. This just exactly what Malcolm Turnbull said about the banks in the lead up to the Royal Commission. So it does happen. But that's it. Yeah. Question asking Nicholas, you're exactly right that it's very difficult to measure, especially when it's falling in that grey zone, especially when you've got passionate people on both sides. And so even when pollsters go out and try and ask questions about it, you can wind up in the situation where you have two different sides with two different pollsters with two different polls who both seem to be saying that you do and don't have social license. So one of the problems that social license has is that there'll be really clear cases. Yes, there will, but there'll be a lot of cases where there's just so much contestation about it that it just won't look constructive to try and tease it out through a social license lens. Yeah, it is absolutely an issue with social license.
By the way, Leslie, we're at 3:30, but there are still some more questions. Can we keep this discussion opening whilst thanking those who want to leave for their attendance? Is that okay, Leslie?
Yep, you're more than welcome to. That's fine.
Okay, that's fine. As I say, thank you very much for attending those who have. Obviously, we aren't entrapping you here, but I hope to some extent the thing is that if we've got decent answers to the very good questions, you will feel that staying on is a little bit of some use. There was the next question is, with so much controversy and pushback against SLO, why don't you consider something else, something that demonstrates meaningful outputs for and support by communities? Look, I think that SLO is one expression. I think I was trying to say this is one expression of the values that organisations, especially industries, must consider and further, other than the bottom line. And I think that there have been lots of attempts to try to express the different ways in which corporations and industries can think beyond mere profitability. And so that I think that it's not that SLO is the only way to express this. As I said, there are a number of others. I've always quite liked SLO because virtually all the others are about what business does. and it's that business has to sort of report on the trip and bottom line. They have to sign up to the co-principles. They sign up to the UN Global Compact, which is basically a set of principles without a lot of detailed obligations. So I quite like the SLO because it's a way of expressing these things which genuinely comes to the community. And it's not what a corporation or an industry or even that matter professor says. It's something that's granted and not granted or taken away by people. So whereas I don't think it's the only relevant value, I think it has some legs, it has some use. It's not the only one you'll use, and it's not as if all of a sudden the others are delegitimated. But I think that I've found that SLO, and I've been writing about this stuff for 30 years, that it's a bit different from the others and is a useful way of pursuing it. But often it's just a pathway into a normative discussion rather than, of course, the full answer.
Yeah, that's right. So, I guess the quick answer is, as Charles said, it's just one tool, and it's going to be useful and helpful and constructive in some cases, and it's just not going to be useful and constructive in other cases. And there are just different options that will tilt the balance in various ways. So, corporate social responsibility was very voluntary for corporations, what they actually did. And so that tilted the balance, you would say, a little bit further in favour of the corporations. Are there ways where we can have, as the question suggests, more meaningful outputs for communities? Well, you bet they are. You bet there are. Obviously, the one that springs to mind immediately would be the situation in New Zealand with many of the Maori, where because of the treaty, a number of the things that will happen, including what we would term as blue economy operations, have to go through free, prior, informed consent. It's not necessarily just an outright veto of what we don't want this, but it does mean that there is a much more specified plan and process that has to go through something much more legally substantial and demanding than simply saying, oh, well, you should have social license to operate. So certainly there are more meaningful ones, and ones that do put the community far more into the driving seat of what's going on. And obviously, as ethicists, we think that can often be a very good thing.
Andrew Sullivan. Somebody said the new regulations have been out last week and they're inadequate. Sorry, I don't think either of us have read the regulations yet. So it would be extreme arrogance for us to make comments on them, but we'll be looking at them. Thank you very much. Andrew Sullivan notes, sorry, this is jumping up now. Andrew Sullivan notes Richard's question above. I'm interested to discuss who holds the responsibility to achieve SLO to operate in the offshore wind industry. The process is being led by the federal government, but will be handballed to private enterprise once the legislative licenses are issued. Given the common nature of the ocean, should governments take a larger role in ensuring SLO is being maintained? I think that there's a slide that something that Hugh and I have talked a lot about, the slide that you saw about the analogy between legal license and social license. I think the thing is that there are interesting comparisons and there's interesting similarities. One other thing to note about it is that when you say, look, they're completely different, then you suddenly find there are some more similarities than you realise. I think though it's important that legal license and social license not be conflated. The two of them can be mutually supportive. And I think that the government, when they issue legal licenses, should take note of the extent to which there is, or there may be, or there may not be a social license in future. And so I think that the two should look together. But I think that it's the government's job to issue or not issue or give stringent conditions on a legal license, and that should be, in a sense, have a dynamic relationship with the social license.
Yeah, it's a complex question, as Charles is suggesting. It's complex also because of the timing of the way the system will work, where the governments, both federal and state, will need to make a lot of decisions before the industries are players here, right? Because the zoning will have to happen, and the acceptance of certain, even the licensing processes, that will happen. The industry can't build the social license before a lot of things have happened from the government side, because the industry are not there and are not committed and are not invested until a fair way along in these processes. So it really is a complex thing. And to be honest, I think government does have a significant amount of responsibility, as well as having the legal controls over what licenses are we going to do, how are we going to regulate this space. They do need to be, I think, on the forefront a little about saying, okay, well, we need to be having some conversations with local council, local groups, to see what their worries are, because a lot of decisions are going to get made before industry winds up doing anything, knowing that it's going to be doing anything for sure. And so in that prior space, there's simply got to be discussions about the different types of values that are in play and the different priorities that the state and federal governments will have and the local communities will have. And so I think government is going to have to play a role here, notwithstanding that there will also be, by the time industry gets involved, that they will have to be doing the work here too.
Meta comments on these comments. Most seem quite angry, dubious in the way social license was presented, how it applies, the legitimacy, ethical aspects. How you're planning on addressing these comments and furthering the usefulness of so-called social license to the so-called blue economy, if at all. I think the thing is that we've made very clear in all our writings, and certainly in our presentations today, that if in fact the thing is that people sort of try to give social license to a pig without actually insulting the the industry of raising pigs or pigs themselves, if in fact you are trying to generate social license by being dishonest or dubious, or it's actually, and the warning is that that might work for a while, but the thing is you'll lose confidence, you'll lose trust, you'll probably lose your legal license. And the origins of the social license was, as Hugh said, it was in Africa, where people were engaging in forestry, and they suddenly realized they didn't have it and they needed to have it, and of course they couldn't get it back. So I think that all our emphasis is actually do it with integrity, as ask hard questions about your values, give honest and public answers and live by them. That's the way to integrity. That's the way to social license. And if you reckon you can shortcut and bullshit people, probably it might work for a little while, but not for very long. And so I think that we're very conscious of what the issue we're taking, and we're trying to address it.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I think social license just can be used in different ways, and it is going to take a certain amount of work to get the idea of social license and the phenomenon of social license pushing in the right direction, so that we do get better ethical results from the outcome from it. And hopefully in my presentation we did have a couple of those. I did skip quickly over that last slide. But there are different ways that can be done that are going to make it more likely that social license will wind up actually being a pressure for more ethical conduct, rather than the opposite.
Last question from Jessica Collin, and like all the others, excellent questions. If the CRC is funded by companies that are making vague and misleading statements of claims of sustainability, how do you resolve that? If CSR science and program are being invoked to back up the misleading claims of sustainability and greenwashing by the salmon industry, isn't it responsible with the ethics team to respond directly? I think the thing is that I think we're not an individual fact checker. But it is our role to set out the ethical process, and I think that it's funded by corporations. I've got to tell you that anybody who wants to become an academic in order to become rich is far too irrational to ever make it as an academic. We're not in it for the money. We're in it because of the principles, and we recognise that that some people can do the right thing, some people do the wrong thing, and we want to structure both our conversations and our integrity systems to increase the probability that the right thing is done. And so certainly I think that we were not brought on by the blue economy to blue wash, greenwash, or whitewash anything, but as serious, honest ethicists and we will always do our best to do that, because, as I say, we're not in it for the money, because we're not that stupid. Hugh.
Yeah, no, I think that's about right. I think it is one of the cases that the ECR, science and programs might be being invoked in various different contexts, and obviously, if that's being done in a misleading way, then it should be called out as such. And and the extent to which the science backs up one way or the other isn't something that Charles or I are experts on, but certainly it is true that if it is being done in a misleading way, then that is ethically wrong and is something that shouldn't be being done, and that's something that we all should be working to improve so we get better results.
Well, look, thank you all. They've been excellent questions. I want to remind you that the webinar recording will be available in the coming days. Check out the CRC's news and events page on their website for any upcoming webinar and workshops. And a reminder that the practitioner's summary report, which we've drawn up, can also be found on the website under the projects page. So thank you very much. We appreciate your listening, and wish you a very good evening, wherever you may be in this great continent.
Perfect. Thank you all.
Thank you.